Hi, I'm Tom Perini from Buffalo Gap at the Perini Ranch, and we're here to help preserve Texas history. And this is benefiting Buffalo Gap Historic Village and Frontier Texas in Abilene. Let's talk about some history. When the soldiers returned from the Civil War, they were broke, they were defeated, it was a bad time. And they didn't know how to make a living. I mean, it was a troubling time. But the one thing that they had were thousands of head of longhorn cattle that had been doing what they're supposed to be doing when they were gone. And so they tried to figure out how they could make money doing this. And so Joseph McCoy in Abilene, Kansas, brought a railhead in to buy cattle. He was a cattle broker. And he sent the information down to Texas and said, we want Texas Longhorns, which gave these guys the go-ahead to do this. And so, driving 2,000 head of cattle to Abilene, Kansas, and 2 months plus, how do you feed them? How do you take care of this? That's where the chuck wagon came in. And Charles Goodnight is credited with developing the first chuck wagon. And he took a military wagon, put a box in the back of it, which is this, and that kept the small utensils, and that's where they would keep the food. And this wagon could travel with the trail drive and feed 12 or 15 guys 2 meals a day. And they said, this is going to work. So this gave them the opportunity to go forward on the trail drive and make this work. So it was a wonderful invention, actually the first mobile kitchen. When you talk about food on a chuck wagon and a cattle drive, trail drive, everybody thinks, oh, this cowboy food is really great and everything. Well, it was a little iffy because, of course, in those days there was no refrigeration. And so that eliminated a lot of things. If you were at your home in South Texas, you could have put perishable food in a bucket in a well, or you could have smoked meats. But on a trail drive, that's not going to happen. So when you think about this, you're feeding 12 to 15 men that are working very hard for 2 months, 2 meals a day. And people say, what do you mean 2 meals a day? Well, when you think about the food that they had, it would have been probably pinto beans. It would have been some type of sourdough bread and some type of meat of some kind, probably salt pork. And salt pork was a huge, important deal for these wagons because they could get salted salt pork in 50-pound slabs, put in the bottom of the wagon, cover it in bedrolls, and if it got rancid, they still ate it. They did not have granulated sugar, but they had brown sugar or cone sugar. But they did not have, you could get granulated sugar, but it was terribly expensive. So they didn't have it on the trail drive. So you might have had a little molasses on a biscuit. Now, the next morning, you probably had pinto beans, a biscuit, and salt belly. The difference is, after you had your breakfast, you would put that salt belly on a biscuit or 2 biscuits, wrapped it up in your chief or whatever, put in your saddlebag. So at noon, when you started to get hungry, you didn't stop 2,000 head of cattle walking. You walked with them, and that's what you had for lunch. And so it was a simple, you think about it, why they didn't have scurvy and stuff, and if they'd been 3 or 4 months, they probably would have. But they filled them up, but it was not what I would say would be the gourmet. If I'm saying, boy, I want real Texas food or chuck wagon food, you'd probably be disappointed. But it worked. And that's how they fed these people for 2 months and it satisfied them. But when they got to the end of the trail, they wanted other things. You know, the drink of choice, and actually the only one besides water, was coffee. So they would have coffee beans, and it was Arbuckle's coffee. And they had a process where they soaked the bean in a sugar or something, and it retained its flavor. And it was what everybody was drinking. And so, but in a bag of Arbuckle's coffee was a little piece of peppermint. And you know, to us, when we're surrounded by all this stuff, all kinds of candies, it wouldn't impress you. But to a cowboy that was out on the prairie, that was a treat. And so the cook would get the cowboy to grind the coffee. This is a coffee grinder. And he would grind the coffee to get that peppermint. And so I think that's just a great story when you think about it, and how, but if you're out in the middle of the prairie and you had a peppermint stick, that was a big deal. You know, now that we've talked about food, let me talk to you about a very important person on this trail drive. And that would have been the cook. If you had a good cook, you could get cowboys much easier. If you had a bad cook, you had a problem. So you normally had a main cook and you had a helper, and that helper was referred to as Mary. I can't explain that, but they referred to the second cook as Mary. You might have a chuck wagon, and then you'd have another wagon that would travel with them that would be called a hoodlum wagon, and it would carry more water, more firewood. So you've got to remember, when these guys they're in front of the herd, so when they passed something and there was a piece of wood out there, they stopped and threw it in the back of the wagon, because they had to have wood every meal. If they didn't, they used dried cow chips or buffalo chips, but they preferred wood. So they would gather the wood up, or stop and camp at a place that had wood that the cowboys could drag up. I know one story they had where, you know, they had a big log, and the cowboys would actually rope the log and drag it to the fire, and drag it into the fire. As it burned up, they would pull it forward. And so in the morning, they still had coals, which was very, very important. So the Mary and the cook would gather water, which was very important, and firewood, and would have to have something. I think they were reusing food all the time. I don't think, you know, not to our standards, but I mean, I think cooked salt pork probably worked a couple of days. You know, now we've covered the chuck wagon, food, chuck wagon cooks. The next step is getting the herd together. And so they had thousands of head of wild cattle, and they would go out and gather them. The important factor is you had Mexican cowboys, you had black cowboys, you had white cowboys, but the Mexican taught them how to be cowboys. When you look at all the names that have come out of Mexico with Riata and all of these things, that these are all Mexican names. So they would get the cattle in groups. They would castrate the bulls. That makes a bigger animal and easier to drive. They would put road brands on, which meant those cattle might have had somebody else's brand on them. But they would do a road brand which was just for this drive. It would be a W, or it would be an X, or whatever. They'd brand everything with a road brand. Then they would try to gentle them. They would ride through the herd. They would try to ease them down so they were not crazy. And then the time came to go. And a steer, a big steer, could walk 15 miles in a day. A cow, being smaller, would do 12 miles. So most of these cattle drives had steers. You had some that had cows that were going for for stock, and that's where but with the cow you have problems, because if a cow has a calf, she will not leave that calf. And they had to develop what they had a wagon that was where they would go out and get the calf and put in the wagon and follow and then put it out at night, because the cow would not leave. So the easiest one was the steer. And so that's what most of the cattle were when they went up. So these cowboys, after they'd settled the cattle down and gone through this whole process, when they left, the cowboys had to know exactly what they were doing. But they were going to run into buffalo herds, bandits, Indians, rivers, creeks, snakes, anything you can think of, thorns, all of this stuff for a 2 or 3 month period, depending on how many cattle you had and how far you were driving them. So when we say cowboys, and a lot of them were boys, it was a tough deal. I laugh at some of the John Wayne movies that I love, but it was tough. But it was the only way they could make a living, and they would start out. And I'll say it could easily be a 2-month drive. And the one thing to remember is that not only did they have 2,000 head of cattle, but they might have had a remuda of 75 horses that went with these cattle. And so the cowboys were constantly switching out. And that was the only way they could go these distances. And so the remuda was very, very important. So I keep going back to 2,000 head. You had one group, that was the number one group, every morning after you'd get them and they'd lull them down, and the cowboys would sing their songs and do all of that, and they would bed down. But in the morning, when it was time to start things, the lead steer would get up, and their group would get up and walk to the front. Then you had another group that was in the center, and you had one group that was in the back, which was a drag, every time. And so they knew where their placement was. So when you had cowboys driving these cattle, and you had cowboys in the back working the drag, they were constantly pushing. You've heard of Old Blue and some of these that were lead cows, very famous ones. That's the truth. They know where they were going. I don't know how they decided they had a vote or whatever, but it was very important how this cattle drive, how it worked. So between the cattle handling of how they did that, how the cowboys would go around them and push them, and how the remuda fit and the chuck wagon, you see this was a pretty tough deal. It wasn't casual, and everybody had to do their part. In 1866, Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving did a cattle drive that came right through Buffalo Gap on its way to New Mexico. And they had a contract with the Bosque Redondo, which was the Indian Navajo reservation. And they did 3 of these cattle drives. But 100 yards from here is where they passed, going through Buffalo Gap. And I think that that the movie Lonesome Dove was patterned after this particular cattle drive. But that was an early big cattle drive for Texas, and I think very famous. And the first drive, they did some steers and cows, because they took some cows up to Denver. But that was very tough on them, and so they never did that again. From that point on, they went strictly with steers and did it. So in 1867, you had the Chisholm Trail, which is the one everybody has heard. And that is the old I-35 highway going through Fort Worth and Dallas. And that was a very famous cattle trail. They drove lots of cattle up that in the early days. But they ran into a little problem because they went through some farmland and stuff in Kansas of farmers and brought with them, unfortunately, Texas tick fever from the cattle in Texas. And the farmers revolted and said, you can't come through here anymore. And so when that happened, after 8 years, the trail moved over to the Western Trail. And that's the one that came right through like Abilene and Baird and all of that, going up to Albany, or at that point there was no Albany, but to Fort Griffin. And that was a major trail that I think lasted about 12 years. And there was a spur of the Great Western that came through Buffalo Gap going that direction toward Fort Phantom. And these were major cattle trails with thousands of head of cattle. And this one was going to Abilene, Kansas, where the other one went to Dodge City. So from a standpoint of all these cattle trails and how this works in supplying beef, all of these cattle, I mean, they were sent to St. Louis and processed there, and all the meat was shipped and packed in ice, and it really was a very major deal. I think when it was all said and done, that these 3 cattle trails delivered like 2 million head of cattle in 20 years. So after Goodnight and Loving had watered their cattle right here, this used to be called the tributary to the Clear Fork of the Brazos. It's now called Elm Creek, but that's where the old deeds go back. They went out on what we call the flats between now where present-day Tuscola is and Buffalo Gap. And of course, it wasn't here either. But they bedded the cattle down, and during the night there was a large thunderstorm, and they had a major stampede. And they went around them and circled them and finally got them calmed down. And then from there they went through the hills and went over to Fort Chadbourne. But it was a major stampede that they talk about in some of the history books. And that, from a danger standpoint, there were a lot of cowboys killed in stampedes. The last cattle drive, to my knowledge, on the Western Trail was 1886 or 87. In my opinion, barbed wire and the trains, like in Abilene, we had the T&P come through, so there was no reason to drive cattle to Abilene, Kansas. But the interesting thing is that when that happened, the chuck wagon was still important, and now you had ranches in Texas, and you had cook shacks, and you had peach trees and gardens and smokehouses, and all of a sudden the food changed. It really was good. And they used the chuck wagon on roundups. And so they'd take the chuck wagon out on a roundup, and that's where the cowboys, that was the home. And so they would feed the cowboys on roundups. But at some point they kind of fell out of, I think it was difficult. They had to get teams and whatever, so they either were put in barns or let to rot. So in the early 70s, some friends of mine, Cliff Tynert from Albany and Bill Cobble and Garden Brooks from the Cowboy Hall of Fame, we decided we were going to try, people were trying to rebuild them at that time, and they were using plywood and sheetrock screws and steel wheels, and we said, we've got to stop this. And so we developed some rules and developed a couple of chuck wagon associations, and all of a sudden chuck wagons have had a resurgence. Now you have cook-offs and stuff, with 10 or 15 wagons, and the only problem is they're all perfect. It's very hard to judge, but it's a very popular sport at this point. So now you've got people that have new chuck wagons that are very nice, and so it's got a second life. So it's a pleasure when we get to see this, to think about what's happened in history with these. We're going from longhorn beef to high choice lip-on ribeye. of how the beef industry has grown and how it's changed. We now have wonderful beef animals. Longhorns serve their purpose. The meat's a little lean, but they serve their purpose and develop the industry. But this is what's the product today. So this is whole loin. This is what you would cut ribeye steaks out of, or in our case, we're going to make a prime rib out of it. You'd cook this in a 350-degree oven for 2.5 hours to an internal temperature of about 130, 35 to medium rare. We're using our Perini Ranch steak rub on it, and we apply it heavily. And boy, is it good. So we'll be doing this, and we'll also be doing our hominy recipe. First of all, it's one of the largest sellers we have in the steakhouse. It's hominy and green chilies and onions, and cheese, and it is wonderful. I've had people say, I don't like hominy, and when they're through, they do. And so it's a very good dish and very Texas. And then you go to the bread pudding. And I've had a lot of bread puddings in my life, and most of them I don't like. But we do ours with sourdough bread and Texas pecans with a little whiskey sauce to kind of settle your stomach. And a combination of these three things is very hard to beat. And I'm starting to get hungry now. Beef has taken a major change in quality and in marbling, and it's really started out with the cattle drive. Now at this time you have very quality beef. This is High Choice Certified Angus, and this is a beef program that we use that we've been very pleased with, and the quality is very consistent, and this is exactly what we serve in the steakhouse. It's very good. So when you take this piece of meat out of the oven and you need to let it rest, it's a big piece, and if you cut into this right out of the oven, it will evacuate all the juices. Don't do that. Let it sit 20 minutes or so. It'll still be hot. And if you slice it acrossways like this, you'll be fine. But the resting part is probably the most important part in cutting this. And most people take it out and cut it, and it just all the flavors and stuff go away. And so, if I were to say something in closing this is the Texas you expect. I hope you've enjoyed our history lesson, and I hope you'll come to Perini Ranch in Buffalo Gap and have dinner.
It's biscuits and beans, beefsteak and coffee, hot when it's sunny and cold when it rains. It's a hard way of living and a hard way to travel, but 100 years later the memories remain. Them old Dutch ovens ain't hot anymore. They're the object of our stories and songs, but they'll hold a special place in my heart till the last Cocinero and wagon is gone. It was built camp by sundown and up before the dawn. Our bellies full of breakfast by the time that we rise. But now the cookhouse is full every morning for breakfast, The wagon's been sold and there's a tear in my eye. The old Dutch ovens ain't hot anymore. They're the object of our stories and songs, but they'll hold a special place in my heart till the last Cocinero and wagon is gone. Well, the cook fire's out and the coffee is cold. We look to the west in the evening and cry. There's biscuits and beans and beefsteak and coffee, like the red man and the buffalo, their days have gone by. The old Dutch ovens ain't hot anymore. They're the object of our stories and songs, but they'll hold a special place in my heart till the last Cocinero and wagon is gone. They'll hold a special place in my heart till the last Cocinero and wagon is gone.